Today we will discuss the Arab-Israeli conflict. A clear learning target. Describe the historical events that contributed to the founding of modern Israel. Describe the historical events associated with the Six-Day War of 1967. Explain how the Yom Kippur War of 1973 affected Arab-Israeli relations. Describe the various attempts at lasting peace in the Middle East. On June 1967, Israel launched a surprise preemptive strike against Egypt. Israeli forces destroyed most of the military aircraft in the Egyptian, Jordanian, and Syrian air forces. Within 3 days, Israeli forces took control of the Sinai Desert and reached the Suez Canal, and within 6 days, the Israelis controlled the West Bank, Golan Heights, and the Gaza Strip. Much precipitated that event, which we will discuss next. We will take a look at the historical events that led up to the founding of modern Israel, the historical events of the two Israeli-Arab wars, their effects on Arab-Israeli relations, along with various attempts to establish a lasting peace in the Middle East. After the Balfour Declaration of 1917, institutions of the nascent or developing Jewish state began to take form, and Jewish immigration into Palestine increased. The Zionist movement purchased large tracts of land. That resulted in an Arab backlash resisting further Jewish immigration. In 1939, the British government changed its position, issuing a white paper, which is a statement of government policy that ended its commitment to Jews in Palestine. Many Jews who had immigrated to Palestine to begin a new state were hardened combat veterans of the brutal battlefields of World War II, and they threw themselves and their expertise into the fight, which was assisted by good internal lines of communication. As a result of the Israeli defense and counterattack, their border widened beyond their mandate from the United Nations. Only 2 small parts of Palestine remained in Arab hands by 1949, the Gaza Strip controlled by Egypt, and the West Bank controlled by the Arab Legion of Transjordan, which later became the nation of Jordan. Jordan annexed or took over the West Bank after the fighting ended. International opinion again changed after Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany slaughtered millions of Jews prior to and during World War II, resulting in a flood of refugees into Palestine. Under pressure from Harry Truman, President of the United States, Britain handed the issue over to the United Nations, which agreed to partition Palestine between the Jews who had immigrated and the Arabs who were already living there. After the U.S. Department of State told President Truman that the newly established nation of Israel would not be viable, meaning not able to survive on its own, he then said he could not support an independent state of Israel. The Jewish community in Palestine was known then as the Yishuv, which the Arabs attempted to prevent from arming itself. The Jews then clandestinely or secretly shipped heavy arms into Palestine so they could arm and prepare themselves for what they felt was a looming open conflict with the Arabs. A Zionist leader named Chaim Weizmann persuaded President Truman to pledge support to Israel, and he did so. Ben-Gurion proclaimed the establishment of the State of Israel on 14 May 1948. Arab forces invaded the newly proclaimed state the day after, on 15 May, with a force of around 25,000 from 7 different surrounding nations. Israel defended with around 35,000, including irregular troops and auxiliary forces. The result of the Arab invasion was the newly established Jewish state was a Israeli victory, thanks in part to the battle-hardened Jewish soldiers who had recently fought in World War II, an effective command and control system by Jewish forces, and good internal lines of communication. By January 1949, Arabs controlled only the Gaza Strip and West Bank, Jordan having recently annexed the latter. The ensuing armistice agreement gave partial control of the old city of Jerusalem to Jordan, along with the West Bank, while Egypt retained control of the Gaza Strip. The Suez Canal is a shortcut for ships sailing between the Mediterranean Sea and Red Sea, completed by Britain and France in 1869, and much of the work on constructing the canal was done by Egyptians. Britain and France had a joint concession on the canal, or contract, granting the right to operate it. Set to expire in 1968, Egypt moved to nationalize, or place under state control, the Suez Canal in 1956. Israel took Egypt's action as a sign they were preparing to launch another invasion. So they quickly mobilized and launched a preemptive strike in late October of 1956, and they fully controlled the peninsula by the 2nd of November. The British and French landed forces of their own later and insisted that both Egyptians and Israelis withdraw from the canal, and the UN in turn insisted the French and British withdraw, which they did. And then the UN took over control of the Suez Canal. The UN also insisted Israel pull back to the 1949 armistice line, which it eventually did by March of 1957, after the UN stationed an emergency force in Gaza. The UN presence would provide peace in the region for nearly a decade, but the seeds of war continued to spread as the Soviet Union armed and trained surrounding Arab countries, while Israel gained arms and equipment from West Germany, Britain, and France. During the 1960s, Syria repeatedly attacked Israeli border villages with artillery from Golan Heights and by air. In April 1967, Israeli aircraft counterattacked, destroying 6 Syrian Soviet-built jet fighters. Syria then coordinated with Egypt for a military buildup in anticipation of another war. In May of 1967, the Egyptian President Abdul Nasser ordered UN forces out of Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula. Egypt then announced a blockade of the Straits of Tiran, which was Israel's only outlet to the Red Sea and markets in the east. Israel considered that an act of war. Israel's Air Force launched a major attack by air on 5 June 1967, which destroyed around 370 Egyptian, Syrian, and Jordanian aircraft while they were still on the ground. They then invaded the Gaza Strip, Jordan, and then Syria, routing the Arab forces. By the time the UN brokered ceasefire, Israel controlled the Sinai Peninsula as far as west as the Suez Canal, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, and the Golan Heights in Syria, all at a cost of only 700 Israeli troops lost over just 6 days of fighting. Israel gained a temporary aura of invincibility after the Six-Day War, but they found new difficulties, including maintaining control of captured land occupied by Arabs and resistance of Arabs living in former Palestine, which led to the rise of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, also known as the PLO, led by Yasser Arafat. Meanwhile, the Egyptians and Israelis waged a low-level war of attrition against each other for years. This culminated when Israeli jet fighters shot down 4 Soviet MiG fighters without any losses of their own on July 30th, 1970. Israel then stepped back from the brink of war and signed another ceasefire. Jewish military tradition was shaped by the diaspora, which was a scattering of Jews far away from their traditional homeland, further buttressed by Russian pogroms, which were organized persecutions and massacres of Jews in the 1880s. Israelis formed their self-defense forces from such experiences, fighting with a ruthlessness and efficiency rarely before seen. Most Israelis were also conscripts, subject to a draft for military service. Anwar Sadat came to power in Egypt in 1970, and a year later proposed peace with Israel if they agreed to withdraw their forces from the Sinai Peninsula. Israel refused, stating they would not return to pre-war borders. After expelling Soviet advisors in 1972, Egypt secretly prepared for war. Egypt launched a surprise attack on Israel-occupied Sinai on Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement, coordinating with Syrian forces. An initial Israeli counterattack was unsuccessful, and Israel lost almost 150 planes. But the tide turned, and by 10 October, Israel counterattacked and reached within 12 miles of Damascus, the Syrian capital. In the south, the Israelis repelled the Egyptian advance into the Sinai and encircled a large portion of their forces. Unlike earlier conflicts, the world's 2 superpowers directly involved themselves, providing heavy airlifts and support, the Soviet Union for Syria and Egypt, and the United States for Israel. Both superpowers worked behind the scenes to broker a peace deal for what became known as a Land for Peace resolution. A ceasefire took effect on 25 October. As a result of the war, Israel's gross national product, the sum total of the country's outputs of goods and services, declined significantly, and they lost many casualties, and their self-confidence was shaken. They also became more dependent on assistance from the United States. During the Yom Kippur War, members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, also known as OPEC, began an oil embargo against the United States, whom they knew to be supporting Israel. An embargo is a ban on trade, and during the early 1970s, the United States were dependent upon members of OPEC for purchasing oil and refined fuel inexpensively. That in turn drove up prices of petroleum sharply and resulted in long lines of people throughout the United States wanting to buy gas for their vehicles. After the Yom Kippur War and devastating oil embargo, the United States knew they needed to find a lasting peace between Israel and its neighbors. The international community also wanted such peace, and so parties from multiple nations met in Geneva, Switzerland in 1977 in order to come to an agreement on peace. The United States and the Soviet Union would oversee those peace talks. However, the leaders of Israel and Egypt did not like more powerful nations attempting to dictate terms to them. In a bold move, the Egyptian leader Anwar Sadat offered to address the Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament, directly in order to discuss peaceful resolutions to issues of the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip. President Carter dropped his support for an international conference and brokered talks between the two leaders of Israel and Egypt at Camp David, outside of Washington, D.C., after which a peace treaty was signed between Israel and Egypt. In the early 1990s, the Berlin Wall had fallen and communism was on the decline internationally. That led to a pervasive mood of optimism. Also, by 1991, the United States and a coalition of Arab nations forced Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, which he had earlier invaded. That generated some goodwill and trust between Arab nations and the United States. The U.S. and Soviet Union convened with Palestinian and Israeli leaders to draft a Declaration of Principles, signed 13 September 1993, in which the PLO condemned all forms of terrorism and limited autonomy for Palestinians and an end to Palestinian claims to Israeli land. Called the Oslo Accords, since it was worked out in the Norwegian capital Oslo. Not all Israelis and Palestinians embraced those ideals, though, and right-wing Jewish radicals assassinated Rabin, the Israeli prime minister. Furthermore, an uprising of Palestinians, known as the Intifada, generated waves of violence throughout the Palestinian territories and Israel itself, further destabilizing peace efforts. President Clinton attempted to get Israel and the Palestinians to make peace through summit meetings and hammered out a plan that was to go into effect by 2005. The Palestinian terrorist group Hamas took control of the Gaza Strip and much of the West Bank, which led to more violence and unrest. More recently, President Trump worked to secure a peace deal in the Middle East during his administration. What role will President Biden play in the Middle East in the coming years? This is a review of what we discussed. Take some time to read each bullet. In summary, here's what we discussed today. The historical events that contributed to the founding of modern Israel, historical events associated with the Six-Day War of 1967, how the Yom Kippur War of 1973 affected Arab-Israeli relations, and the various attempts at lasting peace in the Middle East. That concludes this presentation. Thank you for your time.